Just talk.
It's right there.
This is it. All right, cool. All right, folks. Well, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Samir Lalwani. I direct the South Asia program here at the Stimson Center. And I just promised people on Twitter that I would open this conversation with a Christmas song mashup about the Indo-Pacific. So here it goes. While the weather outside is frightful, the speakers we've assembled are quite delightful. So since you have no place to go, let it Indo, let it Indo, let it Indo-Pacific. All right. So that is to inaugurate the first event of the Asia Strategy Initiative, which is a joint effort by the Stimson Center's East Asia program, Southeast Asia program, and South Asia programs to provide a platform for experts from the region to speak on shifting political and strategic alignments in the Indo-Pacific. It seems to be a trend around town, and the Stimson Center has already been doing this for quite a while, and we're just formalizing what has already been sort of an ongoing discussion with our regional programs. So for this reason, we're happy to welcome Dr. Manoj Joshi, who's a distinguished fellow of the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, to shed some light on India's political strategic priorities in the Indo-Pacific. He'll be joined by several of our program directors, Yoon Sun, Yuki Tatsumi, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Brett Lambert, who will all sort of be introduced by my colleague Elizabeth. But since I woke up this morning and braved the cold like many of you, I wanted to get a few observations of my own before I turn it over to my colleagues. And just say that we've been thinking about this problem or this challenge of the Indo-Pacific through a number of dimensions. The first is just sort of observing that there's a general upward trend of competition in Southern Asia. And this has been sort of a focal point of some work that the Stimson Center has been doing in partnership with War on the Rocks. We have this co-created series called Southern Discomfort, which is observing this rising level of competition, particularly modernization efforts by a number of countries in the Indian Ocean region, China, India, Pakistan, but also Iran, Russia, the United States, and several other partners. And there seems to be tensions being fueled because of this modernization process between nuclear-armed rivals who are all preparing for uncertainty. It's a very understandable strategy that states pursue, but it seems to be intensifying a security dilemma because a lot of states seem to think that offense has the advantage, and that defense and offense are even increasingly more and more indistinguishable. This becomes a world that Robert Jervis described as a doubly dangerous world of a security dilemma. And while there are some who disagree with this, including a recent piece by Srinath Raghavan, that this is not quite a security dilemma in this region, there's lots of evidence to suggest it is. So it's a trend line that I think sort of shapes the discussion about the Indo-Pacific. The second thing one observation that we've noted here at the Stimson Center is that the players are a little bit different than the past. So particularly when it comes to the United States partners in the region in the Indo-Pacific, the reason we've renamed this to a degree with Indo-PACOM, is that India is an increasingly important player for the United States, but it's not an ally. And this is sort of poses a little bit of a challenge or a puzzle for the U.S. It's aligned with the United States, but not necessarily allied. And it has a lot of differences from U.S. partners in the region. It's more of a continental power, more Army-centric rather than Navy-centric. It's still oriented westward rather than eastward. And it has a military that's grown in size in terms of the labor force, in terms of the numbers of personnel, but not necessarily in terms of capital acquisitions in a really robust manner. And this makes for sort of a mismatch between maybe the United States, Japanese, and Australian interests and Indian interests. And we had a speaker here earlier this summer, Air Marshal Matheswaran, who was talking about India's objectives, which are about acquiring capabilities through a long-term process of building a military-industrial base. And this sometimes might be at odds with the desire for acquisition now to deter threats now versus over the long term. The last thing that I think we've been discussing a lot at the Stimson Center is the types of competition that we're observing. The tools of competition are a little bit different. It's not just pure arms racing. There certainly is arms racing and modernization, but there are other things at play. So, for example, we hosted TV Paul recently looking at sort of the competition between India and China and the role of soft balancing or sort of non-kinetic balancing that's playing a role. This is competition in the economic, political, diplomatic space. And this is not a new concept. I mean, it was a very sort of clever term coined by T.V. Paul and Robert Pate some time ago. But this idea that there are other ways to sort of balance rivals through political and economic tools is something that Steve Walt talked about 30 years ago in his book on the origins of alliances. He talks about two other strategies, bribery and penetration. And these seem to be the tools that a lot of countries are fearing China might be employing through its Belt and Road Initiative. Bribery through sort of large-scale sort of economic inducements and infrastructure inducements, and penetration through manipulation of political, of the domestic politics of countries in the region. And it's certainly a fear that the U.S. has animated the U.S. strategy and thinking about ways to compete. So with like large-scale infrastructure investments, Japan is certainly thinking about the large-scale infrastructure investments as well. And so we might expect that these confrontations and competitions will take place in a less kinetic fashion and more in the shadows, and competition in the shadows. And you see sort of these competitions emerging in over the elections in the Maldives, the elections in Sri Lanka, or sort of the dissolution of parliament in Sri Lanka. And there's clearly power plays at work here, but they're not taking place in the same conspicuous kinetic manners that we might have expected. So these are sort of just some general observations that I think will play out sort of in the Indo-Pacific discussion. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Elizabeth to introduce our colleagues on this distinguished panel, and just encourage you all to, if you're going to tweet about this for all those Twitter handles here, to use the hashtag StimpsonNow on Twitter. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Samir. And thank you all for joining us this morning. We're especially grateful to those of you who braved the elements to be with us here in person despite the weather. And we'd also like to welcome viewers who are joining via live stream, both from the U.S. and also across the Indo-Pacific region. We're fortunate to be joined by 4 distinguished panelists who will give us a sense of how they see the Indo-Pacific region evolving and what the impact of these kind of partnerships and rivalries that Samir was mentioning developing there is likely to be. In terms of format, I'll introduce each of our panelists and then turn it over to them for brief remarks before we open it up to Q&A from the audience. So to my far left, joining us all the way from New Delhi is Dr. Manoj Joshi. He is Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and is a renowned journalist, editor, and commentator on national and international politics. He served as political editor of the Times of India, editor of the Hindustan Times, defense editor of India Today, national affairs editor of the Mail Today, and the Washington correspondent of the Financial Express. Previously, he was an academic fellow at the American Studies Research Center in Hyderabad. He's also been a member of the Indian National Security Council's advisory board and is the author of 2 books on the Kashmir issue and several papers in professional journals. Thank you for joining us, Manoj. To my immediate left is Yoon Soon, who is co-director of the East Asia program here at the Stimson Center and director of our China program. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. Previously, she was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she focused on Chinese national security decision-making processes and China-Africa relations. Yoon has also served as the International Crisis Group's Beijing-based China analyst and has additional experience working on U.S.-Asia relations here in Washington, D.C. To my right is Yuki Tatsumi, who is the other co-director of the East Asia program here at the Stimson Center, and she's the director of our Japan program as well. Before joining Stimson, Yuki worked as a research assistant at the Center for Strategic and International Studies just down the street, and a special assistant for political affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington. She's the author and editor of numerous publications on defense and security in Asia. In 2012, she was awarded a letter of appreciation from the Ministry of National Policy in Japan for her contribution to advancing mutual understanding between the United States and Japan. And finally, to my far right is Brett Lambert, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. He's also a member of the Stimson Center's Board of Directors. From 2009 to 2013, Mr. Lambert served as Principal Advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment on all matters related to the Defense Industrial Base. He was awarded both the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service and the Secretary of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service. He previously served as executive in residence with the Renaissance Strategic Advisors and as a senior fellow at NDIA. In addition to his role on the Stimson board, Lambert is a lifetime member of CFR, a senior associate at CSIS, a board member of the Advanced Robotics Manufacturing Institute, and he serves as the Department of Defense's Reserve Forces Policy Board. In 2017, he was named to the Dean's Advisory Council for Kansas State University Polytechnic, and in 2018, he was appointed to the Nuclear Security Working Group. From 1989 until 2007, Lambert held positions of increasing responsibility at DFI International, a national security consultancy. So with that, thanks again to our panelists for joining us. For the remarks, just to kind of set the stage, we'll be moving roughly from west to east. So we'll start with Dr. Manoj Joshi, who will give us the view from Delhi on the Indo-Pacific region, and then head to Beijing, where Yoon Soon will discuss how China views these developing relationships in the region, and then over to Tokyo, where Yuki will give us the view from Japan, and finally to Washington. Brett will speak to how the U.S. Views the developments in the Indo-Pacific, specifically from his time at DoD. So with that, I'll turn it over to Manoj for his thoughts.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you to the Stimson Center for having me here. I'm a bit of an agnostic on this whole issue of Indo-Pacific. You know, geographies are meant to be static, but politics are not, and that's why the concept of Asia-Pacific is giving way to Indo-Pacific. I remember a time when U.S. congressional reports used to talk of Southwest Asia. You know, there's no Southwest Asia anymore. You know, so I look at it that perspective. What we are witnessing is how geopolitics plays out, often in the mind. By renaming the region, countries like Japan and the U.S., they've shifted mental gears, and their own as well as that of the region. So when it was just the Asia-Pacific, China loomed large. When you stretch it open and you add the Indian Ocean into it, China looks a little bit smaller because there's another big country called India there. You know, so that's the kind of geopolitical logic. Of course, there are two rival issues playing out on this issue of Indo-Pacific. One is what we see, the Chinese version, China in the middle, a China-centric order, the idea of community of common destiny. Some people say it's from the Tianxia. I'm sure that Yoon Soon will tell us what all under the heaven and everything is fine under a benign emperor, you know. And then, of course, there's the American and Japanese version, which speaks of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Of course, note that free and open are qualifiers. They're important qualifiers, and they confer on the benign geographic concept, they confer a political dimension. So when we talk of free and open, that's... So, of course, I'm not going to go into the Chinese dynamics, Chinese geo-economic logic, how they're working it out to the BRI. And now we see that why it becomes important is for India is because of where India is located. And so we are located because the Chinese dynamism, economic dynamism is now taking them to the Indian Ocean, South Asia. India is there, and we face competition in South Asia itself and the Indian Ocean region. So India comes into that picture. You, of course, see rival notions. When you see these rival notions, we've just seen an op-ed by Vice President Pence on freedom of, what the FOIP kind of means. The Americans have also finally gotten their act together and are actually putting up serious money, $60 billion in this BUILD Act, and trying to join the Japanese. The Japanese have been active in this quality infrastructure. So you have real competition going on, the geo-economic competition, which is also layering the geopolitical one. The Europeans have also gotten their act together. They say now there's something called the European Connectivity Project, which was announced in September, I think. Now, along with this come the political architectures, the military architectures. For the present, both in the Pacific as well as Indian, the U.S. Navy is by far the strongest force. In East Asia, we have three security visions. We have one of the U.S. hub and spoke system, U.S. ROK, U.S. Republic of China, U.S. Australia, U.S. Japan, and the effort has been now to link them with each other, and which Ashton Carter talked about principled security networks. So networking rather than alliance building seems to be the order. Then there is the trilateral India, Japan, Australia, India, US, Japan dialogues, the Malabar exercises, the Quad grouping, the US, Australia, Japan, India kind of a framework. Now these are all in prototype really. I call them prototype security architecture. They're not really up there. Chinese strategic, experts often dismiss this and they say that they are really aimed at China. With China not having friends and allies in the US style, barring North Korea and Pakistan maybe, the focus of the Chinese security architecture is really in Eurasia, where you have the SCO and the CICA as emerging groupings. What is interesting was the January 2017 white paper on Asia Pacific by the Chinese, where they very bluntly brought out what they meant. Major countries, I'm quoting, should treat the strategic intentions of others in an objective and rational manner. Reject Cold War mentality. These are major countries. As far as your small countries, small and medium-sized countries, need not and should not take sides with the big countries. So it's a very clear, this thing of an hierarchical political order. Small countries stay out of the way. Major countries, of course, we should trust each other, etc. As far as India is concerned, you know that Prime Minister Modi spoke from the shores of Africa to that of the Americas, and he seemed to give a geographic gloss to it. But if you read down in his speech, he also, pressed the other buttons. He spoke of equal access to the region under international law, use of common spaces on the sea and in the air, freedom of navigation, peaceful settlement of disputes. So all these buttons were also pressed. In keeping with its cautious approach, India has moved slowly and deliberately. And you know that I'm not going to list the Indian activities from the creation of the Indian Ocean Regional Association, the Indian Ocean Symposium, the trilateral exercises, the bilateral exercises, quite fascinating. Myanmar, we've had bilateral exercises with, first of all, we've had the whole ASEAN kind of exercises. Then we have bilateral exercises with Indonesia, with Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, etc. And then, of course, you have the Quad. Now, this Quad has come up, but as I explained earlier, this is still a prototype. It's a prototype security order. It's not a, we've had 3 meetings, and in 3 meetings I understood that there were 4 separate press releases, after the meeting. So people were a bit cautious on that. It's at a nascent stage. When we look at the Indian perspective, we need to understand that India is both a continental power and a maritime power. And the security orders and architectures often discussed under the rubric of Indo-Pacific, they kind of ignore India's continental dimension. That India has continental interests, and of course, its primary interests are in the Indian Ocean. And as I said, when you look at the Eurasian, and when we look at this, there's no point just looking at the maritime dimension. You need to look at the whole Eurasian dimension out there. So there we see that the United States hasn't really put up anything. The Chinese have put up the SCO, they put up the CICA. They talk about this, but again, these are in a very kind of a nascent stage. Now, to sum up, I think the Indo-Pacific notion will not work unless India buys into it. But there is an Indian angle that needs to be fleshed out. See, as of now, it would appear that the US has invoked it to bring Indian military capacities into the Pacific. But India has abiding, if not overwhelming, interests in the Indian Ocean, especially the western part, where it has large diasporas, and from where it gets a significant portion of its energy reserves. If you really look at where India, most important place on earth for India is the Northern Arabian Sea. And that is a fact. And also in addition to that, the Indians have, as a nation, have certain Eurasian calculations. Now the point is we are blocked on one side by Pakistan, and so we work through Iran, we work through Russia, etc. These are important parts of our perspective as a nation. We cannot ignore the Eurasian dimension, and I think unless we look at these combinations, we know that the United States moved very far. They created the Indo-Pacific Command. They renamed the command as the Indo-Pacific Command. But the command is still to stretch its way out to Eastern Africa. And that will really make a difference, because right now we have zero conversation with the US Central Command and the US African Command. And those happen to be in the most important area of India's interest. I'll just conclude here, and we can take up things subsequently.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Manoj, for those thoughts. I'm sure we'll want to follow up more on Q&A. Yoon?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for having me on this panel. I'll focus on China. And thank you very much, Manoj, for mentioning my analysis on the Chinese hegemonic stability, the pursuit of the Tianxia system. I think just to begin with, I think the Chinese, if we look at the paradigm, I think the difference between the Chinese paradigm and the U.S. paradigm coming to the Asia-Pacific is the different visions for the regional security order or the regional strategic outlook. Dr. Mike Green argues that U.S. focus or the U.S. priority in the Asia-Pacific region is not necessarily hegemonic stability. It's a balance of power system that's aimed at the prevention of the emergence of a Euro-Asia power that could deny United States the access and playing a role here in this region, which forms a pretty sharp contrast to what the Chinese vision for the region looks like. And Xi Jinping has made it quite clear that China's vision is a community of common destiny, which sounds like propaganda. But if you look at the Chinese political culture and the strategic concept, that when China looks at the world, the concept of the Middle Kingdom, Beijing and China being the center of this hierarchy, this hierarchical system, is quite central to this concept. And I'm sure everyone knows that the Chinese perception of the domestic order and the international order is very much focused on the hierarchy. So the world is harmonious not because everyone is created equal, but because there is a strictly defined and strictly implemented hierarchy that each country fits in the system according to the material superiority and the moral benevolence or the moral competence of each actor. But that's pretty much the Chinese version of hegemonic stability theory, although they have a very different moral codes, a different set of, for example, definition of what constitutes the rules or what constitutes the norms of the system. So I think that's the underlying competition between these two very different visions for the future of the region. And then coming to the issue of how China views the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think for a very long time, the Chinese, I should first start by saying that the Chinese policy community has devoted quite a significant amount of resources and attention looking into what the Indo-Pacific strategy really means and what it really includes. And what is different from the previous, for example, rebalancing to Asia or the previous U.S. policy towards the region. And the substantive differences that they identify is mostly focused on India, because when they look at, for example, the U.S.-Japan alliance or the U.S.-Japan-Australia trilateral cooperation, those have been there, even those predates the Trump administration. So, and when they look at the economic aspect of the Indo-Pacific strategy, well, yes, there's a commitment of 60 billion, and in the summer there was a commitment of 113 or 30 billion, million. Not billion, million US dollars in terms of the infrastructure, but that's really not comparable to what the Chinese economic resources that have been thrown into the region. So I think when the Chinese look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, their essential question is what is different and what is substantive and what is substantial. So when they look at okay, well, there is the tendency in China to equate Indo-Pacific strategy with Quad. So they look very specifically at China's relationship with the four countries, and draw conclusions that Indo-Pacific is still very much a U.S.-China problem. It's a U.S.-centric problem, because when they look at, for example, they look at Japan. China's relationship with Japan this year, starting from 2017, has improved significantly. Starting from summer of last year, what the Chinese have identified is a very intentional attempt from Tokyo to send goodwill signals to Beijing about Japan's willingness to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, about the potential of cooperation with China, which led to the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang's visit of Japan earlier this year, and then the October visit of China by Prime Minister Abe, which was unthinkable basically 2 years ago. So this, what they call the renormalization of Sino-Japanese relations, in the Chinese perspective, has very much been fostered or cultivated by Trump administration's policy toward the region. And the Chinese identified a Japanese tendency to hedge because of the uncertainty associated with Trump's trade policy, for example, towards Japan. So the Chinese don't believe that Japan's long-term goal has changed or the long-term regional competition between Japan and China has changed. But they do identify that at least at this current moment or in the immediate future, the Sino-Japanese relationship will be on a positive trajectory compared to what has happened in the past 7 years. And then when China looks at India, of course, last year there was a Daklam standoff that many people believed to be the beginning of the deterioration of China's relationship with India. There, I think the Chinese concern about India's external alignment choices and how that is going to affect China's goal and China's role in the region has played a significant role in shepherding or shaping China's reaction or China's policy towards India after the Daklam standoff. What we have seen is a deliberate attempt and significant efforts on China's part to repair that bilateral relationship with India. And this past April, when Prime Minister Modi visited China, had very good meetings with President Xi in Wuhan, what the Chinese was reassured, what the Chinese believe that they are reassured of, is that India will continue to pursue the strategic autonomy. And India will also pursue a balanced foreign relations with all powers, including Russia and including the arms sales from Russia. So there are evidence that the Chinese have identified that is not going to foster a India-U.S. alliance. Although I have to say that's China's primary concern coming to India's goal and India's roles. And then not last but not least, Australia. So China-Australia relationship is probably the worst. Well, maybe China's relationship with the U.S. is worse in 2018. But China's relationship with Australia is not that positive. So Australia has demonstrated significant concern about China's interference, literal interference in Australia's domestic politics. And the concern about how the tech companies from China are trying to seek into infiltrate and to certain indirect control of Australia's key infrastructure, reflecting, for example, in the most recent Australian government ban for Huawei and the ZTE to participate in the 5G infrastructure development in Australia. So that's where China and Australia stand. But when China looks at the relationship with Australia, they look at the trade number. They look at the economic interdependence. And they, based on the fact that China is Australia's largest trading partner, and the size of the bilateral trade is as high as $170 billion US, which is pretty much three times bigger to the Australia's trade with the United States. The U.S. is the second largest trading partner of Australia. So when the Chinese look at the pure and the sheer size of that economic relationship, they have some level of confidence that Australia would not be able to turn its back completely against China like the United States is trying to do. So there are some concerns, but there are also some factors that foster confidence in China. So that is to say that when China look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, at least in 2018, the top priority when China looks at Indo-Pacific strategy, it's a sense of urgency and a sense of direct and immediate challenge to China's core national interest is not comparable to what the Trump administration's China policy has created this year. So when the Chinese prioritize their reaction and their policy response, the most important issue is how to deal with the Trump administration. So that's a U.S.-China relations issue. It's not a Indo-Pacific strategy issue. So based on that, we see very little, for example, direct reference to Indo-Pacific strategy from the Chinese public Chinese government statements. It's almost as if there's one argument in China that we being China, should not in the government public statements should not pay too much attention or should not talk too much about the Indo-Pacific strategy, because the strategy in the Chinese perception is not totally there yet. And if the Chinese react to it too much, then it's going to substantiate a strategy that was not fully substantiated to begin with. So I would say that the Chinese observation of the Indo-Pacific strategy is keen, and they are observing what other substance will be put under the strategy. But currently, the focus is very much on U.S.-China relations. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yoon. That was a really helpful tour of how China sees the wider region. Next, we'll go to Yuki for Japan's views on this issue.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for braving the cold. And I'm actually was one of those people who were driving to work, paying attention to all the school closing changing. Because a lot of school districts around here started from 2-hour delay to like full close. So I was ready to turn around when I have to. But thankfully, one of the benefits of having your child in a smaller school where it makes an independent decision, he gets to school on time and he will stay at school as scheduled.
Although it may not be open.
He can count. So my primary task is to talk about how Japan looks at this whole Indo-Pacific region conceptualization of the geostrategic environment. But I think I would also like to touch upon a little bit of Australia, and then also one country that's a key ally of the United States that often doesn't come up in this conversation, which is the Republic of Korea. So from Japanese perspective, actually,
If we can move your mic up just a little bit, sorry.
so if you, from Japanese perspective, if you ask Prime Minister Abe about this Indo-Pacific strategy, his answer to you will probably be like, oh, I've been thinking about this for the last 10 years, 12 years. And in fact, one of the bilateral relationships he invested most when he was the Prime Minister the first time around in 2006 and 6 through 7 is Japan's relationship with India. And another set of bilateral relationships he invested was Australia. So that trend actually does continue, and the Japan-India and Japan-Australia relationship actually has had pretty much bipartisan support. So it kind of weathered that 3-year hiatus of regime change, ruling party change in Japan. That those two sets of bilateral relationship has really moved steadily along, although it didn't attract too much attention. And it really picked up and revitalized when Abe came back into the office. And one of the first articulation that he did, obviously my mic is not working. So one of the very first thing that Abe did, after he came back into the office, is so it was one of the first thing that Abe did was to contribute the commentary to one of the English media outlets, talked about Asia's democratic security diamond. And he talked about the constellation of Japan, U.S., Australia, and India. And then when he came to Washington, D.C. in February 2013, in the public speech that he did at CSIS down the street, and how come we can never get him, huh? Maybe next time. He talked about the confluence of two seas, and talked about how Japan's interest and also stability and peace and stability, prosperity of Pacific Ocean is inseparable from that of Indian Ocean. So it is obvious that he has continued to think about this constellation for quite a long time. And since his most recent time around, Japan and India and Japan and Australia, actually those are the two really important bilateral security relationships for Japan, to the degree that they are probably, aside from the U.S.-Japan alliance, which is a formal treaty alliance, it's the most institutionalized security partnership that Japan has, is with Japan, India, and Australia. They have all the foundational elements, most of the foundational elements that Japan already has with the United States, including information security agreement, acquisition and cross-service agreement, and also the bilateral agreement on the transfer and the joint development of the defense equipment. And those are the really key components that Japan also has had with the United States for a long time. So it's almost like only missing component of these relationship that Japan has with India and Australia is really the mutual security mutual security treaty, and you're kind of there. But will it get there? Will it ever get there? With Australia, jury is, I think, still out a little bit. But then with India, just for the reason that Manoj articulated, I think it can be as close as the institutional security partnership, but then I think it will stop really just short of formal alliance, is my guess. But Abe's move since 2012, he came into the office looking at Obama administration quite distracted in the developments in the Middle East, and although the administration back then talked about Asia-Pacific rebalance and how to transfer some of the strategic asset away from Atlantic to Asia-Pacific, Japan, at least from Tokyo's vantage point, they really didn't feel like that meat was within it with the word. So there's where's the beef question? And I think that is that concern about the durability of a U.S. engagement in the region and the staying power of the U.S. in the region to play a leading role in sustaining the international order in this wider region has been the key driver for certainly Japan's decisions on investing more in its relationship with Japan, India, and Australia, but try to network those relationships and use it as a vehicle to make sure that U.S. stay engaged. So under Abe, Japan really did invest a lot of time and energy, and they still do, in U.S.-Japan-Australia constellation, U.S.-Japan-India constellation, and Japan-India-Australia conversation is starting happening, and the emergence of the concept of Quad. And actually, that is kind of in line with where Australia is heading, and had been heading for the last couple of years also, that Japan and Australia really see eye to eye in terms of the strategic environment, even more so now that Australia is, at least at the political and the defense world, the perception of China has come much, much closer to what how Japan has been seeing China. So they're at the northern edge of Indo-Pacific, and Japan see Australia as really holding down the fort at the South Pacific area, and it looks at India as the westward power, that kind of counterbalance. So only major power that Japan really have to make sure to stay engaged is the United States, which is now under this current administration is a bigger uncertain factor. Because from Japanese perspective, and then I think most of the U.S. allies in the region will share this view, is that this administration's approach toward the region is quite schizophrenic. On one end of the mouth, they talk about stronger alliance, doubling down on the commitment to its allies. But on the other end of the mouth, the trade approach is quite bilateral, quite divisive. Pulling out of the TPP was a major, major blow for a Japanese agenda. So they're still trying to figure out and navigate how this administration responds to certain things. So they're going back to the basic instinct of what they know is you just need to hug tighter with the United States. But they clearly see the need. They clearly see it that it's just not enough to hug the U.S. tighter. Japan has to hug other security partners of the U.S. tighter also. And I think that probably the organizing principle of the Japanese policy under Abe administration. And then I think Japan and Australia, like I said, shared a very similar worldview. It's certainly not identical because of the geographic location. And I think Australia, in a certain sense, sees more Chinese economic influence in their neighborhood in terms of Pacific Islands, New Zealand, certainly in their own country. And it's kind of finally realized, and something happened, and one day they woke up, and there are all these Chinese investment all over the place around them. And that comes with a significant political influence in the region as well. So that's Australia. So one player that's missing in this constellation is Republic of Korea. And although my primary interest is in Japan, I'm actually a little bit concerned about the state of U.S.-ROK alliance at the moment, for two primary reasons. Over North Korea, Washington and Seoul seem to be at a very, very different place in terms of how they see things, how they see Kim Jong-un's intentions, and where they want it to go. And not only that, in order certainly from the Washington's vantage point, to respond to North Korea effectively, it is imperative that U.S., Seoul, and Japan are more or less in the alignment in terms of the approaches. And the approaches that are coming out of Seoul vis-a-vis Tokyo is utterly counterproductive in that regard. And also, this current administration and Seoul's desire to really engage North Korea and really bring it to reunification, move along the reunification talk, really kind of end up being ROK, suggesting things that are really not helpful for the U.S. security interests in Northeast Asia at the moment, including Afghan transfer is an old story, but then also how this president, at the end of the day, will see the ultimate shape and size of the U.S. force presence on the peninsula. So I see a lot of critical areas in the security that the Washington Seouls are kind of out of step at the moment. So that's kind of why I'm concerned about it, because Republic of Korea minus North Korea situation is also a critical partner in this Indo-Pacific security constellation. So, but then, there are a lot of people in town that knows more about Korea than me, so I'll leave them up to them to assess that situation. But I'll just throw that out as an additional set of concerns that I've been having as I observe the situation, and then I'll punt it to Brett to wrap it up.
All right. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the industrial relationship from a national security perspective between the U.S. and India, and I'm a glass half full guy. So you're dealing with two of the world's largest democracies. Now, on the glass unhalf full, you're also dealing with two of the world's largest bureaucracies. So to change behavior about cooperation, which affects policy, and let's be clear, you start with a policy of engagement with a nation. And in the Bush administration, I give them great credit for beginning that dialogue after a really frosty few decades of relationships. And I was privileged enough to go to university at JMU in the 80s on a Rotary scholarship, and Americans were not all that welcome there at that point in time. But over the years and over the decades, that has really, that everyone knows and understands that has changed. And part of that is just the maturing of the relationship, the maturing of the leaderships on both sides, to the point where now I think, and with the change in the phrases we use in the Pacific, that there's a much clearer understanding of the need for understanding of the need for greater cooperation between the two parties for their self-interest, our self-interest in the United States and India's self-interest. Now, that takes a long time to mature. It has, I believe, at the policy level. It then has to go through the bureaucratic layer, and that has been a challenge. And the Obama administration, I believe, continued the progress that the Bush administration had made in helping make it easier, not just for diplomatic discussions, but for commercial transactions, commercial agreements. And we've seen a lot of the investment going back and forth in the commercial world. We've also seen a break in the aerospace and defense market as well over the past few years, moving from a reliance, historic reliance that India had on a single provider, to a more diversified view of what types of systems and equipment to meet their own security needs and also to meet, frankly, their political needs, did they need to obtain. Understandably, India wants to, they have an incredible, talented, high-tech workforce. It's a low-wage workforce. So on the face of it, there would seem to be a lot of opportunities for U.S. companies, in particular, to manufacture there, to co-manufacture, to produce the products that the Indian government needs for their self-defense and their regional protection. The bureaucratic issues involved in those transfers and those sales and those co-production agreements are momentous, and the only thing that really dampens the bureaucrats on both sides down is a consistent level of policy. And we've been fortunate to have that in this administration as well. There have been 11 significant agreements that have been signed just in the last 5 years. Notably the agreements on DTTI and the STA-1 efforts, which will treat India as a trusted receiver of information and work out the security agreements and relationships that we need in order for U.S. Providers to provide equipment and actually to localize some aspects of that development and creation. So all of this should be seen. There's not a single event, I believe, in this relationship that's going to change overnight. You have to look at it as a very systematic, over time, are we moving in the right direction? And despite the fits and starts of some political comments, I believe what's happening and what we're seeing is the relationship maturing at the bureaucratic level. And at the bureaucratic level, when you have more even behavior at the bureaucratic level, that's when you see industry willing to step in. Industry can be a very important caulk, if you will, to cement the blocks of policy. Because when industries begin to cooperate, whether it's in co-production or technology transfer or in training, that makes it much more difficult for the political spikes to take hold. And so I really, where I would have been quite negative on the possibilities of U.S. to India cooperation 10 years ago, when I was in the first term of the Obama administration, Dr. Carter made this a priority. So we broke down a lot of our barriers to both transfer and cooperation by sheer force, political will. The Indian government at the time was doing the same thing on their side, and it led to small advances. A lot of effort, a lot of work went into it, but we had small victories. We had a few setbacks, but for the most part, it was a very positive experience. With the new administration I believe what you're seeing is the political rhetoric does not have the same effect that it may have had if we had not laid that foundational layer of agreements. Now, it does have an effect. It does cause pause. But U.S. companies are more inclined now than they were last year, and they were more inclined last year than 2 years ago, to actively engage with Indian counterparts and with the GOI to form relationships. Now, stepping back from that, I think everyone has to go in with their eyes wide open. Both the internal political politics of India and their history of reliance on a single source, it should not be viewed in the U.S. as, oh, now it's just going to be U.S. There are reasons, and they're logical reasons, and they're frankly good reasons why the Indian government wants to diversify its portfolio of national security equipment, why it wants a range of offerings, and why it wants as much domestic content and capability as it can obtain. And as long as you, from an industrial perspective, go into those relationships understanding that context and understanding there are going to be bumps in the road, and there will be times when, in the self-interest of the Indian government, they may make decisions, procurement decisions, acquisition decisions that we view, if we look at it myopically in our lens, as why would they do that? You know, they're buying from our enemies. If you read the NDS, you have to understand it in the context of where where the government of India is trying to achieve self-sufficiency and non-reliance on a single actor. And if you understand that, and you're willing to participate in the framework that's been developed, whether it's through the DTTI, the STA, and all of the other agreements we've been able to sign in the last few years with India, then that's a context that really can start to solidify the relationship in a way that will be lasting and will outlast the political leaders, you know, on both sides. Right now, there's great alignment. We don't know if that will happen at the political level in the future, but I do believe industry has an important role to play to help cement those relationships toward a common purpose, which is, you know, in the United States' interest, in the Indo-Pacific region, in India's interest to protect its borders and deal with its historic threats. I think industry has an important role, and I think we're actually on a very good trajectory. And a lot of this is happening way under the currents. That doesn't make news. The delegations that are going over from the Department of Defense that are meeting with the Indian leadership and vice versa, the mill-to-mill relationships that have really matured over the last decade, those are all having an effect that I think is very positive for the future of cooperation between the two countries.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Brett. Before I turn things over to the audience for questions, I wanted to follow up on one. This is obviously a big week for the Indo-Pacific region with the back-to-back ASEAN and APEC summits that we're seeing. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on any key outcomes or deliverables, agreements, or indeed lack thereof, that you'll be watching out for in the headlines this week, so we can get a sense of where the Indo-Pacific region might be going, at least in the short to medium term.
If I look at the recently, Prime Minister Modi went to Tokyo and he had discussions with the Japanese. There were two, again, I think what Brett spoke of, below the radar kind of stuff. There was an agreement on maritime domain awareness, right? And there was one on the what's called cross-access of bases. Now, the Indo-Japanese relationship, the security relationship, as someone said, is a mile wide and an inch thick. A lot more needs to be done in this thing, and there are problems on both sides. In the sense, Japan is only Japan. There's a history in Japan. There's a strong set of public opinion in Japan, which is against the idea of Japan kind of playing a huge security role. And I, for one, trying to be provocative, have often told the Japanese, look, the Americans don't talk to us in the North Arabian Sea. You are dependent on oil which goes through that. Why don't we collaborate, for example, on sea lane security in that area? Meaning stuff coming out of Hormuz and all the way down to the Malacca. And that's a good area. We do a lot of cooperation with the Japanese Coast Guard, for example. We have Coast Guard to Coast Guard. We also have maritime stuff. But what I'm trying to say is that we need to get out of that inch-thick syndrome and try to develop some depth. And I think if the Japanese are serious about sea lane security, because if you look at historical trends, how long will the U.S. provide security for that region? The U.S. no longer dependent on oil from that region. And so there are areas, I'm not saying it's going to happen in a kind of a dramatic kind of a way, but you could focus on certain areas, certain identified areas on the maritime security. We are going great guns on the economic side, by the way, in the sense that we are doing stuff together in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and a huge potential, the Asia-Africa growth corridor. So there is the economic element, I think, is fairly well laid out, and it's basically got to be worked upon. And Japan is a huge investor in India. Meaning when we look at Belt and Road, we often don't realize Japan's helping us build a corridor from Delhi to Mumbai. Okay, and it's building various other corridors, trying to make a high-speed train network. So if you just look at that in its own way, because the challenge for India is that if we go out of our country and build bridges and stadiums in third countries, the people of India will say, hey, we've got a huge problem back home. You're going to build a bridge in Mozambique, but we need several of them here. So India can't be in that kind of a role. So it has to, therefore, we work selective partnerships. And I must say that the Chinese-Japanese thing now is quite intriguing, that the Japanese and the Chinese are going to collaborate in 50 projects, infrastructure projects. This could be a model, in fact, where India could collaborate in a kind of a non-confrontation. We're committed to collaborating in Afghanistan on a third-party project. But we could maybe identify some other countries as well. But insofar as the security part of it is concerned, there are gaps. Primary gap relates to the Northern Arabian Sea and the Western Indian Ocean. And I think the Indian challenge is we often collaborate with countries like France, who have commitments there, and Japan, I think, is an obvious case.
I think for the recent events in the region, on the multilateral front, I don't think China was particularly successful. Li Keqiang made a push for RCEP, but RCEP I'll just say the negotiation process is much more complicated than the Chinese originally expected to be, and the completion is not within sight in the near future. And the negotiation between China and ASEAN on the code of conduct in the South China Sea, now Li Keqiang made a promise that it will hopefully it will be concluded in 3 years. But I think there's a lack of momentum on China's part to push for a binding COC that is going to have the real strength that's required. I think what the Chinese are more focused on currently is a bilateral diplomacy in the region and with the United States. So Xi Jinping is visiting 3 countries, Papua New Guinea, Brunei, and Philippines. He's expected to announce quite a list of packet deals with Duterte in Philippines. Then between U.S. and China, I think the negotiation about what a potential trade deal could look like or could include is intensively ongoing. And based on the most recent information, it seems that the Chinese are willing to address the market access issue and willing to, of course, they have made the commitment that they are willing to address the trade deficit issue. But coming to the industrial policy or the structural reform that's required, the content is still pretty thin. So I would say that from the Chinese perspective, their focus is later is a Xi-Trump summit later this month in Argentina. So regional diplomacy, yes, is important. I think the Chinese attention is really focused on the Xi-Trump summit.
I think from Japanese perspective, and then probably it's to a degree it's shared by other security partners that we have in the region. But I think those countries are still kind of waiting to see the actual coherent vision of the U.S. vision of what they think about free and open Indo-Pacific. What are the main pillars? What are the hallmark initiatives? I mean, we have been seeing bits and pieces like Build Act, Secretary of Mattis' speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue on the polymill element of it. But then when it comes to the more overarching strategic vision that this administration has, I think a lot of us are still waiting. And then I think whether Vice President Pence can provide that, I think will be something that we all are going to watch. From Japanese perspective, Vice President Pence has already stopped by Tokyo. Their major concern right now is how their bilateral trade talk is going to go, whether it really is going to start resembling something that Japan had with the United States back in the 80s of a structural impediment talk. And if that's looking that way, it's really not. It really doesn't look good for Japan and actually the bilateral relationship, because that was such a toxic environment that the two countries had, and I don't think no one in Tokyo certainly wants to go back to that. And I would argue vast majority of us here in Washington don't want to go back to those days. So how that turns out, but then that's more of a bilateral issue. So in terms of region, I think we're still waiting to hear whether what Vice President Pence will say. And I would just say one thing about the Japan-India security ties, and I very much agree with Joshi about mile wide and inch thick. And I would say the same thing about the Quad. It's 2 miles wide and half an inch thick almost, if I borrow your logic. That even in the Quad, but certainly between India and Japan, I think all the low-hanging fruits, whether that's in a formal agreement, talk about kind of future-looking initiatives, those are all picked. So I think it is now I think Prime Minister Abe has done a marvelous job selling those packages as a strategic initiative, but I think he has not been as successful to sell that exact package to the Japanese population. That there's a great hesitance. I think they're more comfortable about Japan projecting its own power within a closer vicinity of their neighborhood, which kind of stops at like Northeast Asia-ish. And anything west of Southeast Asia, there's still a great hesitance of Japanese public to see Japan projecting any kind of like kinetic military asset beyond that kind of like a invisible line. So whether Prime Minister Abe can sell that also to the Japanese public, how that's really actually in the strategic interest of Japan as they look into the future in his remaining time in the office, which is about another 3 years or so, I think that would be one thing that I will probably be paying close attention to.
Well, industry hates uncertainty, so I think the most that industry on both sides, both in India and the United States, are hoping for out of this are no surprises, that just more consistent growth. So industry, whether it's a half an inch thick or an inch thick, industry tends to cling to the edges where they know it's the thickest it is, and they'll slowly start walking across as they gain more confidence. So I think, and we have some of the major defense industry players already, what I would say, doubling down in India, opening offices, starting to have dialogue with the acquisition executives there in cooperation with our U.S. government, and so they're hugging the edges. They would like it to be a couple more inches thick, and anything that comes out of these dialogues that may indicate a fracture or a concern is certainly probably going to have a negative effect on the willingness to engage in the access of not just the technology relationship, but the capital relationship between the two countries. So I'm hopeful that will not happen. Again, as that ice gets more thick through this sustained dialogue happening really at the bureaucratic level, then these kind of events, no matter what spike you might have or what tweet somebody may send, it'll make it much more difficult to fracture the underlying cooperation. And so I'm hopefully that we're directionally moving correctly.
Great, thank you all so much. I think we will open it up to questions from the audience. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please wait until the microphones come around so the viewers on our live stream can hear you. And do remember to identify yourself for our panel, and also try to keep your questions brief. So we'll take a few at a time so we can get as many as possible in. Questions?
David Sedney with CSIS and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia as well as Central Asia. I have a quick comment. The comment is there's been a lot of talk about what Washington wants and what American policy is, and talk about the questions caused by what is seen as the erraticism of President Trump. I would urge the panel to maybe take a look at a broader sweep of American history in the last 20 or 30 years where there has been a swing back and forth on the issues, whether it's relationship to India, relationship to China. I was in the Bush administration in 2007, 2008 when we were talking about pushing the Quad, strengthening relations with India, all these things now. That stopped during the Obama administration, although there was progress on defense trade. That emphasis on the Quad and essentially the pushback at China, which has been revived now. I think Joshi made a great comment about the lack of coordination on the U.S. side. The U.S. talks about Indo-Pacific. I urge everybody to take a look at, this is the map of divisions of the Indian Ocean of the U.S. commands, and you'll see that what was used to call PACOM has a big chunk of it, AFRICOM has a chunk of it, and CENTCOM has a big chunk of it going south from Pakistan. So that kind of lack of coordination on the U.S. side is something people should take important and should take note of. And in fact, you're paying attention to Vice President Pence. Well, Pence is there, but Trump is not. To me, that's the biggest signal of what's happening in terms of the U.S. and the ASEAN and APEC meetings. Vice President Trump, as important as he is, he's not the president. And just as President Obama often skipped these meetings, the fact that President Trump is skipping this meeting, I think, says something about the U.S. focus on this region. I do have a question. I apologize for going a little long on that. The question is really for Mr. Joshi. As Yun Sen said, the Chinese, I think, are banking very heavily that the strain and Indian policy of strategic autonomy will prevail over alliances and partnerships, and that basic dichotomy between what I would call perhaps Hindu nationalism and the Nehru vision of strategic autonomy does not seem to be decided in the Indian polity right now. So I'd really welcome your thoughts on that longer-term direction. Is India going to go it alone with the strategic autonomy of Nehru, or will nationalism push India more to alliances with the U.S. and others? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Other questions? Please.
Thank you. I'm Mike Ashford from Chemonics International. I'm curious if you could pivot, if one of you or any of you have particular opinions in pivoting from the sort of geopolitical of the major powers to the regional integration, and what the role of the powers are in this strategy in terms of energy and economic growth as a Indo-Pacific region, because I believe that was a key component, at least of the stated policy. So I'm wondering if you might just comment on that, whether it's general economic or energy or infrastructure, in terms of the subsets of Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific region.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. All right, let's take those two questions, and then we can do one more round at least. Manoj, do you want to start off?
I think I can respond to the issue of strategic autonomy or closer ties with the U.S. I think you pointed to the right point where you say that India does not seem to have yet figured out what its national perspective is going to be. And one of the big problems of Indian perspective on anything is India has no written national security strategy. Meaning, I don't say that it should be public, but it could at least. The problem is when you have a sprawling country of that size and you have huge government, everyone's not on the same page. If you ask different ministries what is the most important strategic challenge you have, you'd get 10 different answers from 10 different ministries. So one is the government itself becoming more efficient in laying out a strategic vision, sitting down, applying your mind. Now, when I was in the National Security Advisory Board or other colleagues of that, we have actually written up stuff and given to the government, but we are only advisory. They've got to eventually approve of it, because once you approve of it, then you take strategic directions. Right now, if you witness a certain degree of scattering of Indian effort, it's because there is no unified vision of the strategic vision. That's one thing. The second part, what I'd like to bring out, is that when we look at Indian policy, you must also understand Indian policy is born out of weakness. It's the country's weakness as a very large, poor country which has huge challenges to national development. But there is also another weakness, which is the poor management of national security by the leaders of the country. The national security system of the country is managed in a suboptimal fashion. And the result is that though you have large expenditures, whether it is acquisitions, whether it is the kind of money that you're spending, you have a Navy, you'll have a first-class ship of the Navy being launched, but it turns out that it doesn't have helicopters or it doesn't have heavyweight torpedoes to go with it, which come 3-4 years later. So this kind of dysfunctionality of the country's defense mechanism leads inevitably, you see, for you to seek allies. So the point I'm trying to make is, to what extent is India's search for alliance a balance of power issue? In the sense that we, because we feel the balance shifting against us vis-a-vis China in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, and that shift is born out of our own incompetence and weakness, rather than any objective factor, in the sense that if India's defense modernization is delayed by, I would safely say 1.5 decades, meaning we are 1.5 decades behind schedule in defense modernization. If that is the case, then India will inevitably, when it confronts adversaries or potential adversaries like China, will have a sense of weakness and will definitely seek to use third parties to balance. So I'm saying that a lot of this stems from weakness, incompetence, inability of the government to give a coherent direction, and not necessarily issues which relate to the larger vision, which of course, you have rightly said, there is an issue, there is a problem there.
All right, thanks very much. And who would like to take the regional integration, energy and economic growth?
Well, I mean, I think going back to your comments, which I think are, you're much more forthright than I would be on the discussions. I mean, when I was in India in 1986, the light combat or light attack combat aircraft and the light attack helicopter were only 2 years away, and I think they're still 2 years away. So it is a difficult environment from that perspective. We are a bit more fortunate in the U.S. I think, particularly under the leadership of Secretary Mattis. The NDS, if you haven't read it, the National Defense Strategy, is probably the best document I've seen come out of the Department of Defense. It's very direct in the shift of policy. It's only about 13 pages, the unclassified version. The classified version is much more in-depth, and I think answers a lot of the questions you were asking in terms of what is the U.S. policy, not just for the region, but as we enter these peer competitions. It spells out in the unclassified version China and Russia, and then discusses the importance in the unclassified version of partnerships and alliances, and the need of the national security apparatus in the United States to reach out more, I think, aggressively to those potential partners and alliances through a means of mechanisms, economic, mill-to-mill, but it doesn't limit it to mill-to-mill, and that I think was an important statement within the National Defense Strategy, and you saw a similar document come out of the White House in the National Security Strategy, which amplifies those tenets. So I think I think there's been really good work at the bureaucratic level in helping both our friends and our potential adversaries understand very clearly where our priorities and our policies lie in terms of our interests. And that's not just military interests, but economic interests as well. And those are the two documents that I think have done a better job than anything I've seen in probably 15 or 20 years.
Anyone else on that, or more broadly on regional integration? All right. Other questions from the audience?
Thank you. I'm Richard Cronin, a fellow at the Stimson Center. And I have a question, follow-up to both the first and last questions, and that is that apart from the geopolitics and the policies, et cetera, what is the actual status of India's defense capabilities in terms of a defense industry, technology, et cetera, in terms of, for instance, how do they compare with more developed countries, or even China, certainly, on technology, but also the financial and economic resources that they can allocate to the defense side and defense industry in particular, or even to purchase from abroad, acquire from abroad defense equipment. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. And one more, maybe? Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Sawamura from the Asahi Shimbun Japanese newspaper. I would like to ask someone to make some comment on the position of Russia. I understand Russia is a little bit outside of the orbit of the Indo-Pacific region, but recently China and Russia is getting closer. Mr. Abe of Japan is very eager to make peace treaty with Russia, and also there's some country in the region and purchasing a missile from Russia, and also the United States decided to withdraw the IF treaty. So what kind? Also, this kind of the development, how does it make impact on the geopolitics of Indo-Pacific region? That's my question.
Great, thanks so much. So first on status of India's defense capabilities, Manoj, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Thank you. It's nice to see you again, Richard.
Thank you.
I've met Richard so many times in the past when he was in the CRS, and he, like all CRS people, tracked these issues very closely. But I have bad news for you. In fact, I had a paper with me. Unfortunately, I didn't bring it, which I've just written, but I can always send it to you. This year, our Standing Committee on Defense came out with a report, and it found that all three services, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, complaining that this year's capital outlay budget for each three of them, which is used to buy new equipment, was not enough. In the sense, it was not even enough to cover existing liabilities. In the sense, past contracts, they didn't have enough. Now, and this has been the story for quite a while. In the sense that despite the fact that we spend a huge amount of money, now unfortunately, when I reel off figures, I'll speak in lakhs and crores, and that gets a bit confusing. But whatever it is, let me say to you in broad terms, what I found when I did this paper is that, of course, Government of India since late 80s conveniently keeps defense pensions out of the defense budget calculation. But it need not worry us. If you include that, 1/4 of the budget goes for pensions. Another 1/4 goes to pay salaries and allowances. Another 1/4 goes, most of it goes to maintenance of existing equipment. And the Vice Chief of Army Staff stood up and told the committee that 75% of our equipment is vintage. I mean, the word he used was vintage. Now, so it's not that. Now the point is, very obviously, the country is laying out money, spending a huge. It's the biggest amount of single point expenditure of this union government, but it's simply not being spent in an effective fashion. One big problem is the manpower issue. We have an army is far too big, and a lot of them are committed in internal security duties. Now the point is that, to bring the issue short, I mean, as someone put it, that India has an army which is ready to fight a third-generation war, but cannot fight a fourth-generation combat. And this is primarily in reference to China, which is increasingly becoming more and more capable in fourth-generation warfare, heavy use of electronics, precision-guided munitions, etc. So the Indian capability, and one of the reasons, the Prime Minister apparently told the military in one of the meetings that, look, there's not going to be a real war, is there? So, so should we really spend the money here? Because you can imagine from an Indian politician's point of view, he needs to spend the money in his constituencies. So this is the, I would say, problem with being a democracy, that you've got to keep your constituency happy, and you've got to, the Prime Minister is laying out 3,000 crore rupees for his constituency in Banaras. He's doing all kinds of things out there. Now, other politicians also do similar kind of things. So there is a competition for resources, and the armed forces, besides this issue of resources, the second point is they are unable to reform. Now, this reform can only be carried out. It has to be politically led. You can't ask the Chief of Army Staff to reform the army. It just will not happen. It must be politically led, and unfortunately, we've been unfortunate with several of our recent political leadership of the Defense Ministry and of the armed forces. They've simply not been able to do the job that they should do. It requires knocking a lot of heads. I was in the Naresh Chandra committee, which recommended something like 400 different items of reform right across the national security system. But all that has been shelved. So it's not that the government doesn't have the advice. The government doesn't have the political will or capacity to implement that advice. And so the Indian Armed Forces, so that you have the Air Force which says, oh my God, we're going to go down from 42 squadrons to 31 squadrons, it's going to get further down. And as I pointed out to you, the Navy today has these wonderful Indian-designed, Indian-built frigates which don't have integral helicopters. Because they haven't been bought. The Air Force it keeps on trying to buy new aircraft, they never manage it. So it's not a particularly happy situation.
Thanks so much, Manoj. Cognizant of time, I think we have time for one person.
Can I just add one thing to that? I'm more of a I understand we have the same issues, but it is the fifth largest defense budget. It's primarily directed toward personnel, obviously. But the plan that was the latest one put forward has about $150 billion in acquisition over the 10 years, which is about $15 billion, and acquisition for equipment to strike the right balance. So it's the balance we face all the time between, if you think about us, it's almost $2 billion a day. Just imagine that in defense spending. But 2/3 of that is in personnel and O&M. The Indians face a similar problem. So there's a lot of commonality between the issues we face in modernization. We don't refer to them as vintage equipment. We refer to them as museum ready. But other than that, there is quite a bit of commonality of issues that we face.
All right.
Very different levels.
Different levels. Different levels.
I see one comment from the audience very briefly, and then if we can have one person who will be ready to address the Russia question, because I know we're running short on time. But Polly, did you want to make a quick comment?
Yes, please. I'm Polly Nayak. I'm a fellow at Stimson. And I wanted actually to raise the question of how much concern there is within the governments that we've been talking about regarding the possibility that China is actually going forward with the famous string of pearls strategy and using its increased maritime access as anchor for future bases. And I would include the Philippines in that question.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. All right. Yuki, do you want to address the Russia question?
Yeah, very quickly on Russia. And of course, we're coming to at the heel of Prime Minister Abe had the really interesting summit with President Putin, and apparently, without anyone, without any staff, they just had the really deep conversation about how to move this peace process forward, peace treaty process forward, just with interpreters involved. So what actually did happen, and there is what type of margin of interpretation error between the two, and lost in translation, we never know. But from a Japanese vantage point, Russia does have an impact in its defense planning. During the Cold War, Russia is the existential threat that Japan postured its defense postures for, and it took about 10 years for them to shift from that posture to southwestern island chain, which has China as a primary threat. And then all of a sudden they wake up in the last couple of years that China and Russia are actually coordinating a lot of things. They're doing joint drills in the area that Japan actually has a concern with. So now I think they're faced with facing with the question of, do we now have to add both of the forces up when we talk about force posturing and force sizing? And I think jury is still very much out. They're still trying to gauge how genuine this security partnership is. And I think they're still not quite there yet to say, okay, we need to actually automatically add those forces together when we do our force sizing and posturing. But that is definitely a concern. And if Japan starts to be a little bit distracted by Russian action toward the north, or what they might or might not be able to do to assist China in their operations in East China Sea, for example, that would put additional wrinkle that it doesn't need to its defense planning. Manoj talked about the interesting situation of Indian armed forces. I'm very relieved to hear that Japan is not only the country that has that same issue. And plus, in Japan's case, they are grappling with the aging population too. So how to resolve that aging population? Can they really sustain even the current level of force with the increasingly aging population? They have been very closed about immigration. There's a finite thing there's a limit you can go just by try to open up more mosses to women, introducing AI and other advanced technology to substitute some of the functions. So that is a real question that they really need to be grappling with. But to quickly respond to, do countries that we've been talking about, do they have a real concern about China ever try to utilize their maritime capabilities? I think Japan is already worried about it. That's why I think they're trying to make existing measures like ODA and other means of transferring some of its capability to Philippines or Indonesia and Vietnam. And I don't see that trend slowing. And if anything, I think Japan will probably, with the United States, reaching out to Australia and probably India to coordinate some of those actions so that to, I guess, lack of better words, deter China from ever thinking about it.
All right, thanks so much. Very briefly, Ewan, do you want to?
Yeah, just very briefly. On the question of the Indian capability, I was in a discussion in China earlier this year, and they talked about this dot-com standoff and what does that mean. And then I remember one set of comment, which is that, well, China's GDP is 5 times that of India. So if India wants to start an arms race, that's not a problem for China. And I also agree that China also does not have to subject its decision-making to the domestic, public opinion in a way. So there does seem to be some disparity there. I think on the issue of Russia, it's very interesting that China's top concern about Russia since Trump took over is whether this strategic triangle is going to reverse in the other direction, that whether Trump administration will reach out to Russia, and actually they were pretty, the Chinese were pretty keen on finding out whether Dr. Kissinger made that suggestion to the Trump administration. But in a way, China's concern is not about Russia. It's about what Russia might do with the United States. And similarly, China's concern is not India. It's what India could potentially align or do with the United States. So I think that's a still very U.S.-centric perception. But then again, Beijing is very pleased to find out that U.S. policy on Russia is not changing anytime soon. So that fostered further strategic alignment between the two. On the issue of string of pearls, I think the Chinese are undermining their own agenda in a lot of ways. Look at what happened in Sri Lanka, the public opinion's reputational risk, and look at what happened in Burma last week. They announced that they finally reached the deal about the Jiaopyo deep sea port, and depending on whose interpretation you look at, is basically cutting the deep sea port from $10 billion to $1 billion. So I think the way that the Chinese imposed or proceeded with their economic statecraft in countries that have reservations about China's intention is a bigger problem. And I would assume that similar problems will arise in Malaysia already and in Philippines.
All right, we are getting the signal it is time to wrap up. So I think that is all the time we have this morning. Thank you so much for those questions and for joining us again, braving the weather outside. Thanks also to our live stream viewers and to our panelists. Please join me in thanking them.
Yeah, no, it's like I'm heading home after this.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's right. Oh, so I'm going to analysis. I got that one.
Oh, you did?